Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to look at epilepsy in children. Epilepsy remains the most common chronic neurological disorder affecting children. Now, when we talk about epilepsy, it's important to understand that we're not actually talking about one single disease. Epileptic seizures occur as a direct result of abnormal electrical activity in the brain, but they can have many different underlying causes. So, in fact, it may be more accurate to think of epilepsy as a group of different disorders, or, as some researchers refer to them, the epilepsies. Let's take a moment to look at how common epilepsy is across different age groups. Interestingly, its prevalence increases with age, but the pattern isn't completely straightforward. There are actually two major peaks. The first occurs in childhood, particularly between the ages of 5 and 9, when the prevalence is approximately 375 cases per 100,000 people. The second and considerably higher peak occurs among people over the age of 80, where the prevalence rises to around 545 cases per 100,000. When we focus specifically on children, estimates of incidence vary quite considerably, ranging from about 41 to 187 cases per 100,000 children. Another important point is that the incidence tends to be higher in low and middle-income countries, particularly in rural areas. And finally, it's worth remembering that childhood is a particularly important period in the development of epilepsy. In fact, more than half of all epilepsy cases begin during childhood. So, with that background in mind, let's now move on to the different causes and types of epilepsy seen in children. Now, before we look at the different types of epilepsy, we need to be clear about what actually qualifies as epilepsy. In general, epilepsy is diagnosed when a person has had at least 2 unprovoked or reflex seizures occurring more than 24 hours apart. However, there is an important qualification to this definition. We can also diagnose epilepsy after just 1 unprovoked seizure if investigation suggests that the person has a sufficiently high risk of having another seizure, specifically a risk of more than 60% over the following 10 years. A diagnosis can also be made when a person has a recognized epilepsy syndrome. Now, although this definition applies across all age groups, applying it in children can be considerably more challenging. This is particularly true in newborn babies, or neonates, because seizures can be extremely difficult to recognize in this age group. In addition, their seizures are often what we call acute symptomatic seizures, meaning that they occur in response to an immediate underlying problem. And there's another distinction that's particularly important here. Not every seizure means that a person has epilepsy. For example, seizures associated with a fever, those occurring within 7 days of a head injury or cerebrovascular hemorrhage, and seizures occurring during an active central nervous system infection are not classified as epilepsy. The same applies when a seizure results from an acute metabolic or systemic disturbance, such as low blood glucose, low calcium, low sodium, or inadequate oxygen levels. So, when assessing a child with seizures, we need to ask not only, has this child had a seizure, but also, what caused it, and is there a continuing risk of further seizures? That distinction is fundamental to making the diagnosis of epilepsy. So, what are we looking for when we take the history? A typical epileptic seizure tends to be sudden in onset and offset, relatively brief, and stereotyped. In other words, the episodes tend to look very similar each time they occur. We also want to know what happens immediately before and after the event. Symptoms before the seizure are sometimes referred to as pre-ictal symptoms, while afterwards we may see what are known as post-ictal features. These post-ictal features can be particularly useful. For example, a child may be drowsy or confused after a seizure, or may experience temporary problems with speech or memory. Another important clue comes from eyewitness accounts. If someone can reliably stop or change the child's activity simply by intervening, for example, by touching the child or speaking to them, then we need to consider whether the event might be non-epileptic. And we shouldn't restrict our questions to events that happen while the child is awake. Episodes occurring during sleep also need careful assessment. Brief, repetitive, and stereotyped events that occur repeatedly during sleep may initially look like a sleep disorder, such as a parasomnia, but epilepsy needs to be considered as well. Now, the clinical examination is equally important. We're not simply looking for neurological abnormalities. We also need to consider the child's development, psychomotor progress, physical appearance, and any congenital abnormalities or features that might suggest a neurocutaneous syndrome. Let's turn now to febrile seizures, because these are particularly common in pediatrics. Febrile seizures are the second most common type of seizure in children and occur most frequently during infancy and early childhood. In many cases, simple febrile seizures have a good prognosis. However, prolonged or complex febrile seizures have raised concerns about a possible relationship with later temporal lobe epilepsy and changes in the hippocampus. There are also several factors that increase the likelihood of recurrence. These include a very young age at the first febrile seizure, particularly before 12 to 18 months, a family history of epilepsy or febrile seizures, and frequent febrile illnesses. However, here's an important point. We shouldn't automatically assume that a prolonged febrile seizure is simply a febrile seizure. In some children, particularly those with certain genetic epilepsies, it may actually be the first presentation of an underlying condition. Dravet syndrome is one example, as are other disorders within the GEFS+ spectrum. This is also why we need to be careful when interpreting what parents describe as abnormal behavior. For instance, a child may cry after a seizure because the experience was frightening or uncomfortable. The crying itself doesn't necessarily mean that the child was having a seizure at that moment. And there's an additional challenge with very young children, nonverbal children, and children with developmental or intellectual difficulties. They may simply be unable to tell us what they experienced. They might not be able to describe an unusual sensation or an aura, for example. This is where technology has become surprisingly useful. Smartphone recordings can provide clinicians with valuable information because parents can record an episode and show exactly what happened. If the diagnosis remains uncertain, referral for specialist assessment may be appropriate. In some cases, prolonged video EEG monitoring can help us establish whether the events are genuinely epileptic. Finally, once we've established that the episodes are likely to be seizures, the next fundamental step is classification. Under the current International League Against Epilepsy framework, seizures are broadly classified according to whether they are focal, generalized, or of unknown onset. There is also a separate classification approach for neonatal seizures. And that classification is important because it provides the foundation for everything that follows, including identifying the underlying epilepsy syndrome and deciding on appropriate management. Thank you for your attention.